Well, thank you for that fine introduction. It proves that not all forms of inflation are harmful, I guess. Appreciate it, Carl. I know that was a geeky tax economist joke. It's okay. It's kind of early for those. You know the difference between an introverted and an extroverted tax economist, don't you? I'll give this to Carl. An introverted tax economist looks at his feet when he talks to you, right? An extroverted tax economist looks at your feet when he talks to you. So, greetings from the land of make-believe in Washington, D.C. As Reagan would say, Washington is an island surrounded by reality. And isn't that the case? And after this election, I think it's the case more now than ever, as we've got the inside the Beltway, thinking of more spending and more taxes, and they just want to keep that gravy train rolling. And then all of you out in real America here, we saw a huge gain in the state legislatures for conservatives, not only here in Montana, but across America. And we are excited to see what that will produce in terms of good fiscal conservative policies, good spending reforms, good tax reforms. And I know my good friend Barry Paulson is going to talk a lot about spending reforms here today, and he's got a great new study out. I'm going to talk a little bit about the tax reform angle and about our book, Rich States, Poor States, which we have free copies for all of you in the back. Put this together with Arthur Laffer and Steve Moore at the Wall Street Journal, and it's now in the third edition, where earlier this year with all the budget shortfalls and everything, we thought we'd have to rename it Poor States, Poorer States, from Rich States, Poor States. But ALEC is a conservative organization of about 2,000 state legislators nationally. How many here have heard of ALEC and have worked with us in the past? So a fair deal, about a quarter of the room maybe. So definitely the rest of you that are legislators especially, or private sector members, we'd love to have you get more involved with ALEC. And I will have ALEC membership brochures and applications that you can sign up as a legislator and get involved with us. We'd love to have you. We were founded in 1973, and we're the Jeffersonian free market fiscal conservative organization of legislators. We think that, along with Ronald Reagan, that the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And we've been around since 73 promoting this Jeffersonian agenda. And this research on rich states, poor states is pretty personal to me. I come from a town of Saginaw, Michigan. Anybody ever heard of Saginaw, Michigan? Other than the Simon and Garfunkel song, there's a couple other, you may have driven through. It was an old General Motors town, and in 1960, the population was 120,000. Today, the population is 55,000. And we saw industry leave in mass. We saw labor costs get out of control. We saw tax costs get out of control, and we saw Michigan become uncompetitive, and the Michigan brand became almost worthless in the last decade. We forget that Michigan never recovered from the 9/11 recession. We were in a single state recession, as we like to say, for about 4 or 5 years when everybody else was recovering, and that just wreaked havoc on the Michigan economy. And this was such a departure from the 1990s when Michigan led the nation in manufacturing job growth under Governor Engler. And so, really the policy drove a whole lot of where we headed. I think with the budget deficits in the states, Montana is in better shape than a lot of places, considering, some of the inherent advantages you have here in some of the sectors that have remained strong while everyone else has kind of struggled. I think that still the discussion needs to be around the fact that, as Carl mentioned quite well in his opening remarks here, is that this is not a shortage of tax revenue. It's an overspending problem. And in Dr. Paulson's paper, he shows that quite clearly, is that he shows the revenues and how much they've grown, and then the overall spending and how much it's grown over the past decade. And the culprit's pretty clear. And this is not only the case in Montana, this is the case in the other 49 states, because if you take a look at it, If you were to limit, let's say, growth of spending to a rate of population and inflation growth as a reasonable tax limitation and revenue limitation, you would see that instead of 49 out of 50 states having shortfalls last year, you could almost flip that on reverse and see 49 out of 50 states having budget surpluses over the last 10 years if that type of spending restraint was implemented. And so the American people understand this. Rasmussen this summer put out a poll that said, what's the cause of the current budget shortfalls? 75%. A full 75% of Americans said that it was the overspending and the politicians' unwillingness to cut spending that is the problem that we're facing today. And it's, this is not a new problem. I mean, there's such a thing called the business cycle, right? We all know about that. In the private sector, there's booms and busts. However, in the government sector, a lot of times we forget about that and we just keep spending. And during the good times, especially when the revenue comes in, like Carl said, we just spend and spend and spend every last dime of it, and we don't save for a rainy day, and we don't give the taxpayers back what they're due in their surplus funds. Now, the number one fiscal problem, I think, facing states today is the problem of underfunding public pensions and health care benefits for state retirees. These two are really a ticking time bomb for the state budget situations in many states. And Dr. Paulson has been working with us at ALEC on this very closely. We've started a subcommittee as a part of our tax and fiscal area to deal with this issue because it's so large. We think that some estimates out of American Enterprise Institute in Washington show that the pension underfunding alone could mean a $3 trillion hole that the states need to get themselves out of. So this makes the current budget shortfalls pale in comparison in the magnitude of what the problem is with pensions and OPEB benefits, as they're called, for state retirees. We've gotten to a point where everyone remember Willie Brown from California, former liberal Speaker of the House, not usually a friend of ALEC. What he said was quite revealing earlier this year in the San Francisco Chronicle. He wrote a column on this, and he said, we have given away, basically, the kitchen sink to public employee unions in our state, and we've promised way too much. We can't afford it, and unless we reform the way, seriously, fundamentally reform the way the state does business, we're going to end up like Vallejo, California, which is the town that, if you remember on the news, went bankrupt because of pension and health care costs. And so, I mean, if folks like Willie Brown on the other side are getting this picture and how bad this problem is, and that the public employee unions have caused a lot of this with just the promises that we've given them that we can't keep, we have a real problem, folks. And, when government says the problem's bad, it's even worse. Now, I don't want to doom and gloom you here today, but I think it's important that we do, shoot straight from the hip on this. I mean, don't we all love Chris Christie from New Jersey? Seen him on YouTube. He's quite a sensation, but, he tells it straight to people, and people appreciate that. And so I think that, we need to get a handle on these two cost drivers. In Dr. Paulson's paper, he's going to go into depth on how to do that. But in short, the private sector solution that has worked very well in the private sector is moved to defined contribution pension plans, 401k type plans that can be portable assets that don't, rely heavily on the government managing these funds and then mismanaging them, as we've seen with the downturn, where many states lost, 25% or more the value of their pension funds in 1 year during a bad market year because they were investing in risky, equities and some places hedge funds and some other very risky financial instruments just so they could try to get a high enough rate of return to minimize their unfunded liability. Because so many states assume 8 or 8.5% long-term rate of return on their assets. This is fantasy land. Anybody here earn 8.5% over the last 5 or 10 years? If you did, let me see you afterwards. I want to get some financial advice from you because it just doesn't happen. Now, when we get there's a few chapters in Rich States, Poor States I'd like to talk about. One I think is particularly instructive. It's called Lessons on How Not to Govern a State. And, sometimes we think that we can learn just as much from the bad examples as we can from the good examples. And unfortunately for me, My home state of Michigan is at the bottom of the bad examples. That's definitely true. So we devote a decent part of that chapter to Michigan. But let me start with California, one of my favorite states to skewer their fiscal policies. Basically, their approach, and Vicki can tell me if I'm wrong on this, but their approach is that they followed the philosophy that Reagan warned us of, that if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it, and if it stops moving, subsidize it. And over the last few decades, that philosophy has gotten them into an awful lot of trouble. Now, they have some of the highest tax rates in the country. Their income tax is over 10% at the state level. They have one of the highest state sales taxes. Yet, they have a budget shortfall, and if we all remember from last year, they had a shortfall in excess of $40 billion at the state level, and they were issuing IOUs to state vendors because they didn't have the cash flow to pay. And they were giving taxpayers that were due refunds IOUs as well, saying, we just don't have the cash to pay right now, sorry. Last time we were to try that with the IRS, I don't think that would work so well. But that's California's approach. Now, how could this be the case? This presents a dilemma to progressive tax and spenders, because I thought that high taxes got us out of budget problems. California, that shows that that's not always the case, because there's a few things going on here. Obviously, there is the moving van effect. That is, people will pack up and move when taxes get too high and regulations and labor costs get too high. Businesses, entrepreneurs will leave the state. There's just no way that you can build a Berlin Wall around your state lines to keep people in if it becomes uncompetitive. This is really what happened with my co-author, Arthur Laffer, who built a successful business in San Diego. Anybody been to San Diego? Congressman Hunter out there used to represent San Diego, I understand. It's a beautiful place. You really don't want to leave San Diego once you've been there. But Art Laffer did, because he gave himself a 10% pay raise just by moving from California to Tennessee. Tennessee is one of the 9 states that don't have an income tax. And just by doing that, he showed the power of the moving van. And this is part of California's problem and why they'll always face a budget shortfall despite some of the highest tax rates in the country. Now, Karl Rove reports that California will not gain a congressional seat for the first time since 1850 because of this population outflow. And this is really a consequence of poor policymaking in Sacramento. And, ironically, Art Laffer gave us a very real-life example of a Laffer curve effect when it comes to revenue, because, when tax rates get too high and get prohibitive, then people are going to leave, and all of a sudden you see the revenue dry up. The basic theory of the Laffer curve is, and you probably remember this from Econ 101, is that at a 0% tax rate, how much revenue do you think you're going to raise? 0, right? That's the easy part. At a 100% tax rate, how much do you think you're going to raise? 0, right? In the long term, who is going to work just for the privilege of paying taxes? People don't do that. They're going to go take a vacation, have some leisure time. That's the basic the Laffer curve. Unfortunately, with government revenue scoring in the states and in Washington, D.C., we neglect that fact. And we think that actually raising tax rates will raise revenue by that proportional amount, which just isn't the case, because if you take in consideration behavioral effects, that people will change their incentive structure by tax policy, and they'll move and they'll leave and they'll change their activities like Art Laffer did, you're not going to get the revenue promised. Now, New York is another one of the bad examples that I like to talk about. They're losing another seat or 2 in Congress in the new round of redistricting because of their population losses. They've lost about a million and a half over the last decade at least. They've lost 40% of their congressional representation over the last generation because of population losses. Now Texas has more Fortune 500 companies headquartered within its borders than New York does for the first time. This happened about a year or 2 ago. And then New York, on top of it, wanted to kick people when they're down. In the middle of the downturn, they created this millionaires tax to increase the income tax rate on high-income earners. Now, you may have heard Rush Limbaugh talk about this if you're a Rush Limbaugh listener. He left New York once and for all, went to Florida. Florida doesn't have an income tax either, incidentally. But the story I like to tell about New York and the millionaire's tax, and that you just can't tax the geese that lay the golden egg and get away with it, is that Tom Golisano, who's the founder of the Paychex Company, owner of the Buffalo Sabres hockey team, lived in New York, built successful businesses. But he said when they passed this extra income tax increase on high income earners, that's enough. Enough is enough. That's the last straw. So he moved to Florida with no income tax. Now, people asked him after the fact, why did you do this, and what are you going to do in Florida? And he said, I got sick and tired of the folks in Albany always asking for more when they had a spending addiction. But now that I'm in Florida, I'm going to build a new business. I may give money to charity, but for darn sure, the folks in Albany are not going to get my money. Now, what does this result for the New York Treasury? The New York Treasury is going to lose over $13,800 a day in lost income tax payments from Mr. Golisano alone because they taxed him out of the state. That's the type of Laffer curve effect that we see every day in state policy, and you just can't tax and expect, you can't tax your way to prosperity. Now, New Jersey is another good example. Unfortunately, these bad examples are concentrated in the Northeast and the Rust Belt many times, in California. But New Jersey, in 1965, New Jersey did not have an income nor a sales tax. And it was one of the fastest growing states in the nation. Today it has some of the highest rates on both income and sales, and they perpetually have a budget deficit, and they're always going back with tax increases and asking for more from taxpayers. They have a situation where over the last decade, 9 out of 10 jobs created in the state are government jobs. They have an anemic private sector because of the poor labor and poor tax policies. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about New Jersey is they also increased an income tax, called it a millionaire's tax, although it started at something like $500,000 of income. Now, by doing that, there was a study by Princeton that showed after the millionaire's tax was enacted, it resulted in $1 billion less in charitable giving in the state of New Jersey because so many of those people were engaged in philanthropic activities and decided to leave New Jersey for good, and they took those dollars with them. And so this has a very big impact on social policy for New Jersey as well. But there is a bright side for New Jersey, and his name's Chris Christie, and I think that he's really taking on the public employee unions and the tax code and is looking at doing some pension reform. He's vetoed the millionaire's tax as they wanted to repass that this year. So bright things could be coming for New Jersey. Now, in Michigan, my home state, I like to leave the best for last here. There's no coincidence, really, that Detroit, Michigan made it on the cover of Rich States, Poor States this year, because I think Detroit is really the epicenter of bad fiscal policy today. This is a city, mind you, that in 1960 had 2 million people living within its borders. Today it's about 790,000. That just tells you how bad Detroit has gotten. You can go onto eBay and buy a house for under $1,000 in Detroit. You hear stories about how wild packs of dogs are roaming the vacant streets in Detroit and about how they're taking up urban farming because there's so many abandoned buildings that have been knocked over and blight. It's a real sad story. And on top of that, there was a poll taken by the Detroit News that 1/3 of young workers would leave today if given the opportunity and had a chance to leave Detroit. So the future is not that rosy for Detroit. Now, in Michigan in general, we've gotten policy quite wrong over the last decade. Our policy basically under the Granholm administration, and thank God she's on her way out, is that let's soak business for everything they're worth, and let's hire actors to talk about how good of a place Michigan is to do business. You've all heard the Jeff Daniels radio ads or TV ads, and Tim Allen and some others that have done this, Pure Michigan and some of the other initiatives that we've spent millions of taxpayer dollars to promote how good of a place Michigan is to do business. And then we forget that, wait a minute, our labor costs and tax costs and all regulatory costs are way out of line, so people aren't going to come just because of Jeff Daniels. Then the other thing is we forget that taxes on business in Michigan are really a tax on people, because at the end of the day, businesses don't pay taxes, people do. Now, this is something that conservative and liberal and every stripe of economist will agree on at the end of the day, is that at some form, people will pay corporate taxes, whether it's consumers in the form of higher prices, whether it's investors and lower rate of return on investment, or whether it's workers. And the most recent research out of the Congressional Budget Office, not known to be a right-wing think tank in Washington, says that corporate taxes fall disproportionately on workers. So when we think of business taxes, it's appropriate to think of those taxes as taxes on labor and taxes on jobs. So really what we have today, after these bad examples, is a very clear contrast in directions for a state. Do you want to follow the New York, New Jersey, Michigan, California model, or do we want to follow the more freedom-loving fiscal conservative model that we see in places like Texas, Colorado, and a few other very good examples that we've seen over the last decade? Now, for instance, Texas, over the last decade on net, has created more jobs than the other 49 states combined. They're going to gain 4 congressional seats in the new round of redistricting because they've seen this huge population inflow. They did medical malpractice reform, where Governor Perry has reported that thousands of new doctors have come into the state because of the more favorable treatment and the lower risk of malpractice problems. And so we have a very clear roadmap. Colorado, where in the last year or two they've muddied the waters a bit, but as Dr. Paulson there from University of Colorado can tell us, because of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights and limiting spending over a 10 to 15 year period before it was interrupted, Colorado was able to reduce tax rates, get government spending under control, and then became one of the fastest growing economies in the nation. So we have a couple of very good case studies on what to do as well. Now, the mistake that the states make that get policy wrong, I think 2 can be highlighted here. One is that people do not work for the privilege of paying taxes. They work for after-tax income to make themselves better off, to raise their standard of living, and to raise the standard of living of their families. The other is the mistake that these states make is that government cannot create wealth. That must be done in the private sector. But all of these states engage in these huge social welfare programs aimed to create jobs through the government. But at the end of the day, we're just, using some government redistribution to take taxpayers from some and redistribute it to others. And at the end of the day, what net gain is there? I don't think there's been much appreciable results in those states that I mentioned. So one of the key findings in rich states, poor states that I should talk about is that state income taxes, whether it's personal or corporate, are some of the most damaging for economic growth at the state level that you can have. We take a look at the 9 states without income taxes, and I talked about a few of those earlier with Tennessee and Florida being in the news for getting a lot of high-profile businesses and individuals moving there. And we compare those 9 states versus the 9 highest tax states. And what we find is over the last decade of economic growth data and population growth that the job growth is over 2 times greater in the states without income taxes than it is in the states with the highest income tax rates. I mean, that is fascinating over a decade period that relationship held true, those 9 versus the top 9. Also, income growth was appreciably higher in the no-income tax states. Population growth was over 2.5 times greater in the no-income tax states. So the notion that people vote with their feet holds true today. We've talked about that for years, but it's true. And people are voting very heavily against high tax, high regulatory, and high labor cost states. And then the one that's not quite as intuitive is revenue growth. We look at the state revenue growth in those 9 states without income taxes and the 9 states with the highest rates, and the no-income tax states actually had more revenue growth, a double-digit percentage-wise greater over the top income tax states. Now, if you listen to some folks, they'll say, well, if we did without an income tax, there's no way government could operate, and we just couldn't raise any revenue, and we've got to have an income tax. And in a lot of respects, the income tax is the opiate of state government because they're addicted to the revenue of the income tax, and it's very hard to get off of it once you're addicted. Alaska being the only state that's ever repealed the personal income tax, and obviously they've got some inherent advantages there with natural resource revenue that they were able to tap into. But this is a very important point because, it can be done. We do have 9 states across the nation that operate without an income tax. They rely more heavily on other taxes sometimes. But the key is to keep government as limited as possible because regardless of what tax policy you employ, if your government is too large, you're going to have a tax policy that chases away growth because it's uncompetitive. They say that the most simple tax policy is this. You could answer it in a couple questions. How much do you make? And then send it in. Of course, that doesn't accomplish the goals that we're looking for, right? So we have to be very smart about devising a tax policy, but avoiding taxes on capital is very, very important. So I think today, we have, as we look at the rich states, poor states research, we have a war between the states today, and that is a war for capital. And the old line from my friend J.C. Watts is that capital is a coward. It doesn't go where it's not wanted. We have to remember that in all the decisions that we make. You don't build Berlin walls around your state lines for people or for capital. And since capital today is more mobile than ever, it becomes that much more important to retain competitiveness as a key tenet of your tax and fiscal and regulatory and labor policies here in Montana. Now, in the back of Rich States, Poor States, which I encourage you to grab on after this session, I'd be happy to stick around and sign some copies, although it may reduce the value of the book for resale, is that Montana's economic outlook ranks 33rd out of the 50 states. So certainly below average there. It's fallen from 30th to 33rd in the last year of our book. Some of the main drivers of this subpar ranking have to do with the extremely high workers' compensation costs here, 49th out of the 50, second worst in the country on workers' compensation costs, the lack of a right-to-work state, and a below-average state tort system, state liability survey that we have. And so, there's certainly some challenges that you have, facing you, but, you have a lot of, new life in the legislature. You're going to have a lot of healthy discussion over the budget as you come back into this session. Obviously, the budget is going to be job number one. I think that it's going to be imperative when you look at the tax side, you're somewhat limited on the tax side. Taxes are on one side of the fiscal coin, spending is on the other. And if you don't get spending under control, it makes it awfully difficult to retain a competitive tax system that is competitive enough to attract capital and people from other states and businesses from other states. But taxes are a huge determinant of where corporations may look to locate, for instance. Randall Stevenson, the CEO of AT&T, gave a great talk at our ALEC meeting this summer in San Diego and talked about how his company moved from New Jersey to Texas, but how even still the company AT&T on net pays more in tax costs at all levels of government than it does in total employee payroll costs. That's how big of a cost driver it is for companies today. And if we want to make Montana a place that not only large companies like AT&T can come, but small companies, the entrepreneurs, maybe a new Silicon Valley, new industries that are coming to look and invest, we have to make sure we get competitiveness right, because that's the story from rich states, poor states. And so as Justice Brandeis would say, states are the laboratories of democracy, and we believe very heavily in that. And, let's make Montana a place that's a laboratory for prosperity. And I think that the work that Carl Montana Policy Institute is doing will lead you in that direction. And you've got some great groups here on the ground. But I'm excited to what we may see in Montana. But with that, I think I'll stop and we'll take some time for some Q&A here. So thank you.
Does that work? If you've got a question, rather than doing the note thing, we've got plenty of time here. So just if you've got a question, let me know and I'll bring you a microphone. This is how I get my exercise today. Sorry.
You mentioned one of the dings against Montana was lack of a right-to-work law. Can you expand on that a little bit, what the difference is in states with right-to-work versus forced unionism are?
Right, yeah. Basically, we have roughly, it's an interesting sample here because about half the states have right-to-work laws and half the states do not, like Montana, which is basically forced union membership if you're in a unionized industry. And so we've seen the growth really take off in those right-to-work states. In fact, we do so much work with the private sector as well. A lot of the CEOs and the people that are in charge of company location will say we won't even consider a state for investment for new manufacturing or company headquarters unless it's a right-to-work state. It's a non-starter if a state doesn't have that degree of labor freedom. And that is, it's incredible to see the results of some of those right-to-work states in the South. For instance, I was recently at an auto show in Michigan, and there was a brochure from Toyota, and you could basically take Toyota, Hyundai, and a lot of the foreign manufacturers that are doing so much of the manufacturing expansion here in the U.S. And literally, the map that you could see their operations that they're expanding in could be almost a right-to-work map, because they're going to those southern states to a large degree, the states that are concentrated right-to-work states. There's not a coincidence why Boeing moved their most recent, their manufacturing operations from Washington to South Carolina. South Carolina made it a very clear pitch in their economic development that that's one of the reasons that they are competitive is their right-to-work status, as well as their legislature voted in the House at least 110-9 this year to repeal the corporate income tax. They're pretty serious about creating a place that's competitive to do business there in South Carolina, and so are all the other southern states with right-to-work laws. And so I think that maybe in the new edition of Rich States, Poor States that we'll do in 2011, I'd like to do a similar growth comparison like we did with the no-income tax states and the high-income tax states between right-to-work and non-right-to-work states, because I think you'll see a very similar relationship.
Anybody else? There we go. There had to be.
You did mention North Dakota. What's North Dakota doing right specifically?
Well, North Dakota has actually been quite a bright spot in the last year or so. They were the only state last year to cut income taxes in North Dakota. Now, they were about the only state that had a sizable surplus last year, and you've seen that some because of their native industries have done well and have weathered the storm better than others. It certainly isn't totally because of their fiscal frugality there in North Dakota. They have spent quite a bit of money, but they just had so much they were able to increase spending plus cut marginal tax rates on income and property. And so they did see some pretty hefty tax reductions there. Now, they still do have to worry that they have this, the neighbor on the south there, South Dakota, does not have an income tax. It's one of those 9 states without. And so North Dakota is making some very good progress. But, if you take a long, historical look at the economic growth between North and South Dakota's always performed better than North Dakota has. And maybe that's changing as North Dakota is starting to send signals that it's moving in the right direction here. But certainly they had a very enviable position to be in as the other 49 states were looking at cutting back and making some painful cuts, and a lot of them, nobody else was really talking about large tax, reductions like that. They were in the driver's seat to become more competitive. Now, you could argue that they could have even become more competitive and plowed more of those surplus dollars into tax reduction efforts, but they certainly were moving in the right direction at least, and so that was a positive development, and we're in sore need of those over the last couple of years in the states.
Anyone else? There we go.
Would you comment on the impact of government regulation and environmental issues with respect to the extractive industries that we have in Montana and how that affects our future?
Yeah, without being an expert in the local regulatory issues here, I can say generally, though, that's one of the reasons that we wanted to basically, in our Rich States, Poor States economic outlook rankings, we separated out into basically 3 categories. It's taxes, it's regulation, and it is labor costs. And that's because regulation is that important. Basically, in states, you can make yourself uncompetitive. Even if you have a decent tax structure, you can make yourself very uncompetitive just through regulatory issues. Now, in Michigan, I know we've had our struggles with environmental overregulation and just a sense that we've driven a lot of businesses out of the state based on Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ regulations there. And probably the ones that you don't see are all the companies that don't come into the state because of poor regulations to start with. And so that's certainly one part of the three-legged stool, as I like to say. The taxes, regulation, and labor costs certainly all go into the formula there.
Any other questions?
Do you see any companies that had sent their operations overseas at any time returning back to the States? Has the climate improved for that to happen yet or not?
Well, there's one thing that, that's a very good question, is that we'd seen so much talk about, outsourcing and capital going offshore. And, asking the question of why, the fundamental question of why that was happening, I think is key before we'll expect to see a whole lot of that return, is that a lot of that was going offshore because, with labor costs as high as they were here versus some of the other nations in the world, but, the tax costs as well. I mean, the U.S. corporate tax system, we have a 35% corporate tax rate at the national level, and then you add the state rates on top of that. The 35% rate at the national level is the second highest in the industrialized world in OECD countries. And so that is certainly a barrier to any further, movement of capital back onshore until we can get the corporate tax system more competitive. Now, the OECD average in a lot of the European countries over the years has moved towards 25% as being somewhat an average. And then if you look at the G7, they're certainly below where we are today. And if you look at an 80 or 90 nation sample of the largest nations, they're moving towards 20% or below on their corporate tax rate. We saw, many of the countries in Eastern Europe, for instance, the developing nations, work to become a competitive place for capital by lowering corporate rates. And in some cases in Eastern Europe have a 0% corporate tax rate, have eliminated corporate taxes altogether. Now, obviously, the U.S. enjoys some inherent advantages with a solid, reliable legal system, respect for property rights. But those inherent advantages don't, get us across the finish line when our tax cost is the second highest in the world. And the only country that has a higher corporate tax rate than we do today is Japan. And their government just signaled in the last month that they were going to work on corporate rate reductions in Japan. So very soon we may find ourselves as the highest corporate tax place to do business in the world. And I think before we can expect to see capital move back onshore, we certainly have to get the corporate tax piece right. Because as you're looking to invest, this came up in the 2008 presidential debate when then Senator Obama and Senator McCain were talking about this. And then Senator McCain brought up the point that, well, we have a 35% tax rate. And Senator Obama said, well, that's a statutory rate. Nobody pays that rate. What's the effective rate? It's got to be much lower. And Senator McCain didn't have a very good response to that. But subsequently, the Cato Institute put out a study done by Canada's top tax experts that showed that the U.S. effective rate, the rate that on average companies pay, is also 35%, which makes the second highest in the industrialized world. And so that is certainly an inhibitor to competitiveness, and we need to get that picture right. I'm not sure where we're headed in Congress with that. There have been some proposals to reduce the rate from 35 to 25, and that would certainly get us started in the right direction.
Yes, I wondered if you could give us any feedback on monetization or quantitative easing, as they call it today, and in relationship to the devaluation of the U.S. dollar and as it's characterized as a tax increase when we lose purchasing power of our dollar, and how does Alex see to stabilize that influence on the loss of productivity, the loss of investment, and the loss of personal wealth in that reflect? Could you comment on that?
Sure. I mean, let me preface my remarks by saying I'm a geeky tax economist and not a geeky monetary economist. But let me just say my general thoughts on the issue there is that obviously by keeping interest rates artificially so low for so long, we certainly face a risk when the economy heats up that inflation is going to be a major problem. And in the past, the history, the Federal Reserve is that they generally, the market beats them to the punch, and that the market will start recovering before they're able to raise interest rates again and stabilize the inflation. And so we could see a real jolt ahead. They don't want to raise interest rates right now, obviously, because the housing sector is so fragile. So the Federal Reserve is in a difficult spot right now. But there's no question that some of their easy money policies contributed to the housing bubble that got us into this mess in the first place, along with a whole lot of bad regulations and requirements on banks. But I certainly am a bit worried, as is my colleague Arthur Laffer, about the potential for inflation if we keep monetary policy so loose. And I think a lot of the issues with the Federal Reserve, I think we need to start with just a basic one that a lot of us can agree on, is that we need to have audits of the Fed to have some more transparency of what's going on with their internal operations. And this is something that Ron Paul's worked on for quite some time, and I believe he'll be chairing one of these subcommittees on monetary policy in the new Congress in the Republican leadership. And his son Rand Paul, elected in Kentucky, has also campaigned on this issue. And so I think you have more watchdogs that are going to keep an eye on the Fed and monetary policy in general now in the new Congress.
I would just like to make a comment that the Cato Institute is where it's at as far as I'm concerned. The heritage people are fine, but you guys can save us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And we work with all the DC think tanks. We work with the SPN groups like Montana Policy. We've got quite a infrastructure out there now of free market leaning groups, and we really have some great resources to take advantage of. That's a good point.
Maybe you could clarify something for me. I heard you remark that the two detriments to our economy surviving and going offshore is, number one, high labor costs, number two, high taxation. Please clarify to me how we can have high labor costs when we have over 10% of our people without jobs.
Right. Well, I think that I think the number one issue there is is tax costs. Really, labor costs in Michigan have shown that maybe that's one of the reasons why we have a big unemployment rate in Michigan, is that our labor costs just got too uncompetitive. And like you see a Laffer curve with tax rates when they become uncompetitive and businesses leave, you see I think a similar effect when there's no compromise from organized labor, that labor costs become uncompetitive, and all of a sudden the inherent advantages that the United States has with stable legal climate and property rights don't overcompensate and don't make up for the fact that labor costs are sometimes magnitudes greater here in the United States than they are in other places. And so that's the experience from Michigan. And in terms of whether we're talking labor, regulatory, or tax policy, competitiveness is key, and we just have to keep that in mind. And not only the private unions, it's the public employee unions that have been some of the biggest culprits when it comes to cost driving and state government budget deficits, because of the legacy cost of the defined benefit pensions and health care, which are really going to push the states over a ledge when it comes to fiscal sustainability.
Last question.
Thanks. I think I saw in the paper this morning, budget proposed $3.7 billion for the state, Montana less than 1 million in population. What's the comparison between like Montana and other states of, how much our budget is percentage of that? I mean, those are dollars taken out of the private sector, moved to the public sector.
Right. That's a biennial budget, right? So, you'd have to, obviously adjust for that. But I don't have those numbers in front of me. Barry Paulson, that has the budget study for Montana Policy here, may have a better handle on the per capita spending, which I think he does. We certainly can look that up for us. So if you'd like, see me afterwards, and I can, give you my card.
All right. That was a quick question and a quick answer, so we'll do one more.
Yeah, can you comment on any correlation between the states that are doing well and the states that aren't doing well with their court system, whether they're more liberal or more conservative? I know we seem to fight that issue here. It seems like the environmentalism they get into the court system, and the court system tips to their favor, and it just seems to have I think, an impact. Can you comment on that?
Well, certainly. I think that, that's one of the reasons why we included the liability treatment and tort systems in one of the 15 variables here in Rich States, Poor States, because when Dr. Laffer and Steve and I sat down to put together what are the drivers of, competitiveness at the state level, I think you have to look at the liability in the court system and the tort treatments in the states to have a handle on, your overall competitiveness climate. And so I think it's very important. I think that, it's a part of the puzzle. In fact, I'd like to see, for instance, maybe the top 10 liability treatments versus the bottom 10, and see the growth over the last decade in both of those places. But by all accounts, it does have a big factor in terms of overall state competitiveness. And I think that you could probably see the job growth, the income growth, the population growth correlate fairly well to those states with a good legal climate versus the states that are very anti-business and anti-job growth. Great. Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. And thanks again to Carl. You're putting on a great conference. I was here 2 years ago. This is even better than that one. And it's better because I have a voice this time. Remember, I couldn't talk last time if anybody was here. So appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, he was way shorter last time. I think the weather was better last time, though. HP has decided that it knows better than I do what my computer should be doing, so we'll get that out of the way. Okay, our next speaker.